Arthur wasn't born with one arm. He lost it years ago in a silly accident involving a runaway lawnmower and a dare from his less-than-brilliant cousin, Billy. But Arthur never let it slow him down. In fact, he'd learned to use it to his advantage. His prosthetic wasn't just a replacement, it was a tool. A very clever tool, indeed. For weeks, Arthur had been observing Gems and Jewels, a sparkling palace of precious stones downtown. He'd watched the staff, noted the security cameras, and memorized the display cases. He knew exactly which emerald brooch he wanted, a rare piece shaped like a hummingbird, rumored to be worth more than a small house. His plan was intricate, like a finely crafted watch. He practiced his movements in his tiny apartment, using a broom handle as a stand-in for the display case. He'd rehearsed the subtle slide, the casual lean, the sleight of hand that would make the brooch disappear into the secret compartment of his arm. He'd even perfected his backstory, a war veteran, looking for the perfect engagement ring for his sweetheart. He imagined the tears in the saleswoman's eyes, the sympathy, the undivided attention. He'd chosen a slightly worn suit from the thrift store, a tie with a military emblem, and a hesitant smile. He knew he had to be charming. People trusted a charming face, especially one that looked like it had seen hard times. And Arthur, despite his intentions, was undeniably charming. He had a twinkle in his eye and a way of making people feel like they were the only person in the room. He'd even practiced his nervous fidgeting, the way he'd rub his hand, or rather, his prosthetic, against his trousers, a subtle sign of vulnerability. Tonight was the night. He took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and headed out the door, a mixture of excitement and apprehension swirling in his stomach. He knew the risks, but the reward was too tempting to resist. That emerald hummingbird was going to be his. The bell above the door of Gems and Jewels chimed softly as Arthur entered. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of expensive perfume. Sparkling diamonds winked from every surface, reflecting the light like captured stars. Two sales associates stood behind the long glass counters, their faces polished and professional. Arthur took a moment to adjust his tie, subtly scanning the room. The security cameras were exactly where he expected them to be. He took a slow, deliberate breath and approached the counter where a woman with warm eyes and a kind smile stood waiting. This was Sarah, the one he'd pegged as the most sympathetic. "Good afternoon," Sarah greeted him, her voice gentle. "Welcome to Gems and Jewels. How may I help you today?" Arthur offered a slightly hesitant smile. "Good afternoon. I'm looking for an engagement ring." He paused, as if gathering his courage. "For my fiancée." Sarah's smile widened. "Oh, how wonderful. Congratulations. Do you have anything in mind?" Arthur shuffled his feet slightly. "Well, I want something special. Something that will really show her how much I care." He lowered his voice slightly, adding a touch of vulnerability. "You see, I was in the service. And, well, things were tough. I want to make up for lost time." Sarah's eyes softened with sympathy. "I understand completely. We have many beautiful rings that would be perfect. What is her style? Does she prefer classic or modern?" Arthur pretended to consider the question. She's a simple woman. But she appreciates quality. Something timeless, I suppose." He glanced around the store, feigning interest in the various displays. "Perhaps something with a diamond. But not too flashy." Sarah nodded understandingly. "Of course. Let me show you some of our most popular selections." She gestured towards a display case filled with glittering rings. As she began to explain the different cuts and settings, Arthur subtly maneuvered himself closer to the display case containing the emerald hummingbird brooch. The game had begun. As Sarah presented a tray of diamond rings, Mr. Davies, the other sales associate, approached. He was a taller, more imposing man with a sharp gaze that missed nothing. He'd observed Arthur's entrance and something about the man's demeanor made him uneasy. "Sarah, are you assisting this gentleman?" Mr. Davies asked, his voice smooth but with a subtle edge. "Yes, Mr. Davies. He's looking for an engagement ring," Sarah replied, a little flustered by his presence. Mr. Davies turned his attention to Arthur, offering a polite but scrutinizing smile. "And what style are you considering, sir?" Arthur met his gaze, his own smile unwavering. "Something classic, as I was saying. My fiancée, well, she deserves the best." He added a touch of self-deprecation. "Even if I can barely afford it." Mr. Davies raised an eyebrow slightly, but didn't comment. He studied Arthur's suit, his prosthetic arm, the subtle tremor in his hand. He wasn't buying the war veteran act entirely. Something felt off. "Perhaps I could show you some of our more exclusive pieces," Mr. Davies suggested, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We have a stunning collection of vintage rings that might be of interest." He gestured towards a locked display case further away from the emerald brooch. Arthur realized he needed to redirect the attention back to Sarah. Mr. Davies was too perceptive. "Actually," he said, turning back to Sarah, "these rings are quite lovely. Could you tell me more about this one?" He pointed to a ring with a particularly large diamond, strategically positioned to keep Sarah between him and Mr. Davies. Sarah, relieved to have the attention back on her, launched into a detailed description of the ring's cut, clarity, and carat weight. Arthur listened attentively, asking occasional questions and feigning deep interest. He needed to keep them both occupied, but especially Mr. Davies. The window of opportunity was closing. He had to act soon. He subtly shifted his weight, preparing for the moment of distraction he knew would come. He just needed the right opening. "It reminds me of a star I saw one night in the desert," Arthur said, his voice low and filled with false emotion. He was referring to the diamond ring Sarah was showcasing, but he was expertly weaving in elements of his fabricated military service. "We were pinned down for days, no water, no hope. But the stars, they were always there. A reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always something beautiful to look forward to." Sarah's eyes welled up. "Oh, that's so moving," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She truly believed him. Mr. Davies, however, remained unconvinced. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Arthur. He wasn't buying the heartfelt story, not for a second. Arthur continued, elaborating on his fake experiences. He spoke of camaraderie, sacrifice, and the enduring power of love. He even added a detail about a fallen comrade who had dreamt of buying his own fiancée a diamond ring, a detail designed to tug at Sarah's heartstrings even further. "He never got the chance," Arthur said, his voice cracking slightly. "But I promised him. I promised him I'd find the perfect ring for my girl. In his memory." Sarah reached out and gently touched Arthur's arm. "You're a good man," she said, her voice filled with genuine sympathy. Mr. Davies scoffed inwardly. He'd seen this kind of manipulation before. He just needed proof. He decided to subtly increase his vigilance, watching Arthur's every move. He knew something was about to happen. The air was thick with anticipation. Arthur, sensing Mr. Davies' unwavering scrutiny, knew he had to change tactics. He couldn't afford to overplay his hand. He needed a distraction, and he needed it fast. He glanced around the store, desperately searching for an opportunity. He just hoped it would come soon. The pressure was mounting. Arthur, feigning indecision, requested to see more rings. "Perhaps something with a different cut. Or a different setting," he asked, his voice carefully neutral. He needed to keep Sarah occupied and, more importantly, keep Mr. Davies from getting any closer. Sarah, eager to provide excellent service, happily complied. She brought out tray after tray of dazzling rings, each more extravagant than the last. Arthur examined each one with meticulous care, asking detailed questions about the diamond's clarity, color, and carat weight. He was playing the role of the discerning customer to perfection. With each new tray, Arthur subtly shifted his position, inching closer to the display case containing the emerald hummingbird brooch. He made sure to keep Sarah's attention focused on the rings, asking her to point out specific details and compare different styles. Mr. Davies, however, wasn't fooled. He continued to observe Arthur with unwavering suspicion, his eyes narrowed and his expression grim. He could sense that something was amiss, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He just knew that Arthur's interest in the ring seemed forced. Arthur finally managed to position himself directly in front of the emerald brooch display case. He could feel the cool glass against his prosthetic arm. He was so close. He just needed that one perfect moment of distraction. He glanced around the store, searching for any sign of an opportunity. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew he was walking a tightrope, and one wrong move could send him tumbling down. He took a deep breath and waited, his senses on high alert. The moment was coming. He could feel it. Suddenly, a high-pitched wail pierced the air. A small boy, no older than 5, stood near the entrance, tears streaming down his face. "Mommy," he cried, his voice filled with panic. "Mommy, where are you?" The boy's mother, realizing her son was missing, frantically called out his name. "Tommy! Tommy, where are you, sweetie?" Chaos erupted. Customers stopped browsing, and staff members rushed to help. Mr. Davies, always quick to assess a situation, immediately turned his attention to the commotion. He scanned the store, trying to locate the boy's mother and ensure the child's safety. "Everyone, please remain calm," Mr. Davies announced, his voice authoritative. "Let's help this little boy find his mother." This was it. The distraction Arthur had been waiting for. With Mr. Davies' attention diverted, Sarah was still focused on the rings, oblivious to what was about to happen. Arthur took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was his moment. He subtly angled his body, shielding his movements from Sarah's view. With practiced precision, he reached out with his prosthetic arm and, using a small, almost imperceptible movement, flicked open the hidden compartment. In one swift motion, he slid the emerald hummingbird brooch from its display case and into the waiting space within his arm. The compartment clicked shut. The entire maneuver took less than a second. No one noticed a thing. The boy's mother finally spotted him and rushed over, scooping him into her arms. "Oh, Tommy, I was so worried," she exclaimed, hugging him tightly. The commotion subsided as quickly as it had begun. Mr. Davies, satisfied that the situation was under control, turned back towards Arthur and Sarah. He still felt uneasy, but he couldn't quite pinpoint why. Arthur, however, was already several steps ahead. With the emerald hummingbird safely tucked away in his prosthetic arm, Arthur continued his charade as if nothing had happened. He picked up another diamond ring, examining it with a critical eye. "This one is quite beautiful," he said to Sarah, his voice calm and steady. "But I'm not sure it's quite right. Something is still missing." Sarah, still caught up in the earlier emotion of Arthur's fake, military story, offered a sympathetic smile. "I understand. Finding the perfect ring takes time. It's a big decision." Mr. Davies, though still unsettled, couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. He watched Arthur closely, but the man's demeanor was perfectly normal. He seemed genuinely interested in the rings, asking all the right questions and offering thoughtful observations. Arthur knew he had to maintain his composure. He couldn't afford to let his relief show. He continued to engage Sarah in conversation, asking her about different diamond cuts and settings. He even pretended to consider a few of the rings, asking for their prices and comparing them to others he had seen. He knew he couldn't stay much longer. The longer he lingered, the greater the risk of being discovered. He needed to make his exit gracefully and without raising any further suspicion. He decided to play the indecisive card, suggesting that he needed time to think about such a significant purchase. You know, Arthur said, sighing softly, this is a bigger decision than I realized. I need to talk to my fiancée and get her opinion. I don't want to rush into anything. Sarah nodded understandingly. Of course. Take your time. We'll be here when you're ready. Mr. Davies, however, remained unconvinced. He knew that Arthur was lying, but he couldn't prove it. He just had to trust his instincts and wait for the opportunity to expose him. Arthur, sensing the tension in the air, knew it was time to make his move. He offered a polite smile to Sarah and a curt nod to Mr. Davies. Thank you for your help, he said. I'll be back soon. With that, he turned and walked towards the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He had pulled it off. He had stolen the emerald hummingbird brooch, and no one was the wiser. Or so he thought. The bell above the door chimed again as Arthur exited, gems and jewels, a wave of relief washing over him. He glanced back at the store, a small smile playing on his lips. He had successfully navigated the intricate dance of deception, and the prize was now safely in his possession. Inside the store, Sarah began to tidy up the display case, carefully returning the diamond rings to their velvet trays. Mr. Davies, however, remained standing near the counter, his gaze fixed on the door through which Arthur had just disappeared. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Sarah, he said, his voice low and serious. Did you notice anything odd about that man? Sarah paused, considering the question. Odd? No, not really. He seemed a little nervous, but I think that's understandable, given the circumstances. He's about to propose, after all. Mr. Davies shook his head. I don't know, Sarah. Something just didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. He decided to trust his instincts. I'm going to check the inventory, he announced. Just to be sure everything is accounted for. Sarah frowned. But Mr. Davies, that's a lot of work. And I'm sure everything is fine. Humor me, Sarah, Mr. Davies insisted. It's better to be safe than sorry. He began to meticulously check each display case, comparing the items on display to the inventory list. He started with the diamond rings, carefully counting each one and verifying its description. Everything seemed to be in order. But then, he reached the display case containing the emerald hummingbird brooch. He glanced inside, his heart skipping a beat. The space where the brooch should have been was empty. He looked again, double-checking the inventory list. There was no mistake. The emerald hummingbird brooch was missing. Mrs. Thompson, he called out, his voice filled with urgency. We have a problem. The game was far from over. It had just begun. Mrs. Thompson, a woman whose perfectly coiffed hair and stern expression suggested she tolerated no nonsense, hurried over to the display case. Her eyes widened as she confirmed the brooch was indeed missing. The color drained from her face. The emerald hummingbird wasn't just jewelry, it was an investment, a symbol of gems and jewels, prestige. Its disappearance was a major crisis. Are you certain, Mr. Davies? She demanded, her voice sharp and icy. Absolutely certain it's not simply misplaced. I've checked the inventory list 3 times, Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Davies replied, his voice firm. It's gone. Mrs. Thompson's face turned a shade of red that threatened to match the rubies in the adjacent display case. This is unacceptable. Do you have any idea what this will do to our reputation? She paced back and forth, her expensive heels clicking angrily on the marble floor. What about the security footage? Sarah suggested, her voice trembling slightly. Maybe we can see who took it. Mrs. Thompson stopped pacing and glared at Sarah. Of course, the security footage. Why didn't I think of that? She strode purposefully towards the security office, Mr. Davies close behind. Sarah followed, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and guilt. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow responsible for what had happened. Inside the small, dimly lit office, Mrs. Thompson barked orders at the security guard, a young man named Kevin who looked perpetually nervous. "Rewind the footage to the last hour and focus on the emerald brooch display case," she snapped. "And hurry." Kevin fumbled with the controls, his face flushed with anxiety. He rewound the footage, and the three of them watched intently as the events of the past hour played out on the monitor. The tension in the room was palpable. They were about to see exactly what had happened, and who was responsible for the theft. The truth was about to be revealed. The security footage flickered to life, showing Arthur's arrival, his interactions with Sarah and Mr. Davies, and his meticulous examination of the diamond rings. They watched as he subtly maneuvered closer to the emerald brooch display case. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward, her eyes narrowed, willing the footage to reveal his deception. They saw the moment when the little boy got separated from his mother, the brief chaos that ensued. Mr. Davies could be seen turning his attention to the commotion. And then, there was Arthur, standing in front of the brooch display case, his body partially obscured by Sarah. "There. Look!" Mr. Davies exclaimed, pointing at the screen. "He's right in front of it." They zoomed in on the footage, but Arthur's positioning and the angle of the camera made it impossible to see exactly what he was doing with his hands. The brief distraction caused by the lost child had provided the perfect cover. "Damn it!" Mrs. Thompson cursed under her breath. "We can't see anything. He's blocked by Sarah." They replayed the footage several times, frame by frame, desperately searching for any clue, any indication that Arthur had taken the brooch. But there was nothing. His movements were too subtle, too practiced. He had executed the theft flawlessly. "He's good," Mr. Davies admitted grudgingly. "Very good." Mrs. Thompson slammed her fist on the desk in frustration. "So, what do we do now? We know he took it, but we can't prove it." Sarah, her face pale with guilt, spoke up. I remember a few things he said. About his time in the military, about his fiancée. Maybe we can use that to track him down." Mrs. Thompson looked at Sarah, her expression softening slightly. "What do you remember?" she asked. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then began to recount the details of her conversation with Arthur, hoping that even the smallest clue could help them catch the thief and recover the stolen brooch. The hunt was on. "He mentioned he was staying at the Grandview Hotel," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "And he said his fiancée's name was Emily, I think. Or maybe Emma." She racked her brain, trying to recall every detail of their conversation. "He also said he served in the 2nd Infantry Division." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her expression thoughtful. "The Grandview Hotel, that's a start. Mr. Davies, call the hotel and see if a guest named Arthur is registered. And check if they have any guests with a reservation under the name Emily or Emma." Mr. Davies immediately pulled out his phone and began dialing. Sarah continued to search her memory, desperately trying to recall anything else that might be helpful. "He said he was originally from a small town in Ohio," she added. "I think it was called Mill Creek. Or maybe Willow Creek." Mrs. Thompson sighed. "Small towns in Ohio, that narrows it down to approximately 1,000 possibilities. Still, it's something." She turned to Kevin, the security guard. "Kevin, pull up the security footage from the street cameras. See if you can spot him leaving the store. And check which direction he went." Kevin, eager to redeem himself after the earlier disappointment with the security footage, nodded enthusiastically and began typing furiously at his keyboard. Sarah felt a knot of guilt tighten in her stomach. She had been so easily taken in by Arthur's charm, so quick to believe his lies. If she hadn't been so gullible, maybe this wouldn't have happened. She was determined to make amends, to do everything she could to help catch him and recover the stolen brooch. She owed it to Mrs. Thompson, to Mr. Davies, and to Gems and Jewels. She wouldn't rest until Arthur was brought to justice. The chase was officially on. Mr. Davies returned from his phone call, his face grim. No one by the name of Arthur is registered at the Grandview Hotel. And no reservations under Emily or Emma. Mrs. Thompson sighed, running a hand through her perfectly coiffed hair. So, he lied. Of course, he lied. What else did we expect? Sarah, undeterred, spoke up. Maybe he used a different name. Or maybe he's staying at a smaller hotel, something less conspicuous. It's worth a shot, Mr. Davies conceded. I'll check the smaller hotels in the area. Sarah, why don't you check the pawn shops? He might try to sell the brooch. Mrs. Thompson nodded in agreement. Good idea. But be careful. This man is clearly a professional. Don't confront him directly. Just call the police. Sarah and Mr. Davies grabbed their coats and headed out the door, determined to track down Arthur and recover the stolen brooch. Sarah started with the pawn shops closest to Gems and Jewels, showing the pawnbrokers a picture of an emerald hummingbird brooch and asking if anyone had tried to sell it recently. Mr. Davies, meanwhile, visited the smaller hotels and motels, asking the front desk clerks if they recognized Arthur from a photograph. He used the description Sarah had provided, a man with one arm, wearing a slightly worn suit, with a military-style tie. The hours passed, and their search yielded nothing. Sarah visited pawn shop after pawn shop, each one offering the same disappointing answer: no, they hadn't seen anything like that. Mr. Davies, too, came up empty-handed. No one recognized Arthur. Discouraged but not defeated, Sarah and Mr. Davies met back at Gems and Jewels to regroup. Nothing, Sarah said, shaking her head. I've checked every pawn shop within a 5-mile radius. Same here, Mr. Davies replied. He's vanished into thin air. We can't give up, Sarah insisted. There has to be something we're missing. She pulled out a map of the city and spread it on the table. Let's think about this logically. Where would he go? What would he do? They were determined to catch him, even if it meant searching every corner of the city. The chase was far from over. Meanwhile, Arthur, confident that he had made a clean getaway, hailed a taxi and directed the driver to a less reputable part of town. He needed to unload the brooch quickly, before anyone started asking questions. He chose a pawn shop with a dimly lit interior and a barred window, hoping for a quick and discreet transaction. The pawnbroker, a burly man with a walrus mustache and suspicious eyes, eyed Arthur carefully as he placed the emerald hummingbird brooch on the counter. The brooch sparkled under the dim lighting, its vibrant green stones a stark contrast to the dusty surroundings. What's this then? The pawnbroker asked, his voice gruff. Looks like something out of a fairy tale. Arthur feigned a casual air. It's an antique brooch. Belonged to my grandmother. I need to sell it. Need the cash. The pawnbroker picked up the brooch, examining it with a magnifying glass. He knew a valuable piece when he saw one, but he also knew a stolen item when he saw one. Something about Arthur's nervousness and his flimsy explanation didn't add up. It's interesting, the pawnbroker said, his voice noncommittal. But I'm not sure it's worth much. Emeralds are tricky. And this setting, it's not exactly modern, is it? He knew he was lowballing Arthur, but he wanted to see how desperate he was. I can give you $200, he offered, his eyes fixed on Arthur's reaction. Arthur's face fell. $200. But it's worth much more than that. It's a genuine antique. The pawnbroker shrugged. That's all I can offer. Take it or leave it. Arthur hesitated, weighing his options. He knew the brooch was worth thousands, but he also knew he couldn't afford to haggle. The longer he stayed, the greater the risk of being caught. He was trapped between a rock and a hard place. He needed the money, but he wasn't willing to be ripped off completely. He decided to try his luck elsewhere. Arthur stormed out of the pawn shop, muttering curses under his breath. $200. The pawnbroker was clearly trying to take advantage of him. He needed to find a buyer who appreciated the true value of the emerald hummingbird. He walked down the street, his mind racing. He couldn't just walk into another pawn shop and expect a better offer. He needed a plan, a way to sell the brooch without raising suspicion. He considered contacting a fence, someone who specialized in selling stolen goods, but he didn't have any connections. He stopped in front of a diner, the aroma of greasy food wafting through the air. He was hungry and tired. He needed to clear his head. He went inside and ordered a cup of coffee, sliding into a booth near the window. As he sipped his coffee, he watched the people walking by. He saw a woman wearing an expensive-looking fur coat, a man in a tailored suit, and a young couple window shopping. He realized he needed to target a different kind of buyer, someone who appreciated fine jewelry and had the money to pay for it. He pulled out his phone and began searching online for antique jewelry dealers in the area. He found several promising leads, but he knew he couldn't just walk in and offer to sell them a stolen brooch. He needed to come up with a convincing story, a way to explain how he acquired the jewelry. He spent the next hour brainstorming ideas, scribbling notes on a napkin. He considered posing as a wealthy collector, a grieving widower, or even a down-on-his-luck aristocrat. But none of the stories felt quite right. He needed something more believable, something that would disarm suspicion and convince the dealer that he was a legitimate seller. He knew he had to be patient, to take his time and craft the perfect plan. He couldn't afford to make another mistake. The stakes were too high. Sarah and Mr. Davies, still determined to find Arthur, continued their search. They decided to revisit the pawn shops, hoping that the pawnbrokers might have remembered something after their initial inquiries. They entered the dimly lit pawn shop Arthur had just left, the bell above the door jingling faintly. The burly pawnbroker, his walrus mustache twitching, looked up from behind the counter. He recognized them immediately. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice gruff. Sarah held up a picture of the emerald hummingbird brooch. "Have you seen this? Has anyone tried to sell it here today?" The pawnbroker paused, considering his answer. He knew the brooch was probably stolen, and he didn't want to get involved. But he also didn't want to lie to the police, especially since these two seemed so determined. "As a matter of fact," he said slowly, "someone did come in here earlier with a brooch like that." Sarah's eyes lit up. "Really? Who was it? Can you describe him?" The pawnbroker hesitated again, then decided to tell them what he knew. "He was a man, middle-aged, I'd say. He only had one arm. Wore a suit, but it wasn't anything fancy. Seemed nervous, like he was trying to hide something." Sarah and Mr. Davies exchanged a knowing glance. It was Arthur. They were on the right track. "Did he say anything? Did he leave a name?" Mr. Davies asked, his voice urgent. The pawnbroker shook his head. "No, he didn't. He just wanted to sell the brooch and get out of here. I offered him $200, but he didn't take it. He said it was worth more than that." "Did he say where he was going?" Sarah pressed. The pawnbroker shrugged. "No idea. He just walked out the door." Sarah and Mr. Davies thanked the pawnbroker and hurried out of the shop, their hearts pounding with excitement. They knew Arthur couldn't be far away. They were closing in on him. They just needed to figure out where he would go next. The hunt was intensifying. Remembering that Arthur had been heading south, Sarah and Mr. Davies continued down the street, scanning the area for any sign of him. A few doors down from the pawn shop, Sarah spotted a familiar figure sitting in a booth at a local diner. It was Arthur. "That's him!" Sarah exclaimed, pointing towards the diner. "I'm sure of it." Mr. Davies nodded grimly. "Let's go." They entered the diner, the smell of coffee and greasy food filling the air. Arthur was sitting by the window, scribbling on a napkin and sipping a cup of coffee. They approached his booth, their faces stern. "Arthur," Mr. Davies said, his voice authoritative. "We need to talk." Arthur looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He recognized them instantly. He knew his luck had run out. "I don't know what you're talking about," Arthur said, his voice feigning innocence. "I've never seen you before in my life." "Don't play dumb with us," Sarah said, her voice trembling with anger. "We know you stole the emerald hummingbird brooch from Gems and Jewels." Arthur scoffed. "You're mistaken. I was just looking at engagement rings. I'm a war veteran, you know. I wouldn't steal anything." "We know all about your little act," Mr. Davies said, his voice growing louder. "We know you're a liar and a thief. Now, give us back the brooch, and we'll let you go." Arthur's eyes darted around the diner, searching for an escape route. He knew he couldn't talk his way out of this one. He had to run. "I don't have anything to give you," Arthur said, his voice rising. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee cup. The cup shattered on the floor, drawing the attention of the other diners. In the confusion, Arthur made a dash for the door. Sarah and Mr. Davies were caught off guard, but they quickly recovered and gave chase. The hunt had turned into a full-blown pursuit. Arthur burst out of the diner and onto the busy sidewalk, weaving through the startled pedestrians. He was surprisingly agile for a man with one arm, his movements quick and nimble. He dodged a delivery truck, hopped over a pile of garbage bags, and sprinted down the street, his prosthetic arm swinging wildly. Sarah and Mr. Davies emerged from the diner, hot on his heels. "Stop, thief!" Mr. Davies shouted, his voice echoing through the street. "Stop, or we'll call the police." Arthur ignored them, his adrenaline pumping. He knew he couldn't outrun them forever, but he had to buy himself some time. He darted into a crowded marketplace, the narrow aisles filled with shoppers and vendors. He weaved through the stalls, knocking over displays of fruit and vegetables, creating chaos in his wake. Sarah and Mr. Davies followed close behind, struggling to navigate the crowded marketplace. The vendors cursed and shouted as they tried to salvage their scattered merchandise. Arthur emerged from the marketplace and onto a quieter street. He glanced back, but Sarah and Mr. Davies were still on his trail. He needed to find a place to hide, a place where they wouldn't think to look. He spotted an alleyway between two buildings and darted inside, hoping to lose them in the shadows. He ran through the alley, dodging overflowing dumpsters and stray cats. He reached the end of the alley and found himself back on the main street, just a few blocks from Gems and Jewels. He realized he was running out of options. He was tired, and his prosthetic arm was starting to chafe. He needed to come up with a plan, and he needed to do it fast. He glanced around, desperately searching for a solution. And then, he saw it. Gems and Jewels. He decided to double back. Maybe, just maybe, he could lose them there. Arthur slipped back into Gems and Jewels, hoping to disappear among the browsing customers. He tried to regain his composure, smoothing down his rumpled suit and adjusting his tie. He walked casually towards the display cases, pretending to admire the glittering jewels. He knew it was a risky move, but he was desperate. He hoped that Sarah and Mr. Davies wouldn't expect him to return to the scene of the crime. He tried to blend in, mimicking the behavior of the other customers, nodding thoughtfully and murmuring to himself. But his heart was pounding, and his breath was coming in ragged gasps. He knew it was only a matter of time before they found him. Sarah and Mr. Davies burst through the door of Gems and Jewels, their eyes scanning the room. They spotted Arthur almost immediately. He was standing near the engagement ring display case, pretending to examine a diamond solitaire. "There he is!" Mr. Davies shouted, pointing at Arthur. "Stop him!" The other customers gasped and stepped back, creating a path for Sarah and Mr. Davies. Arthur knew he was trapped. There was nowhere left to run. He tried to make a break for the door, but Mr. Davies cut him off. Sarah cornered him near the emerald brooch display case, the very case he had robbed just hours before. It's over, Arthur, Sarah said, her voice firm but tinged with sadness. There's nowhere left to go. Just give us back the brooch, and we'll call the police. We don't want to make things any worse than they already are. Arthur looked around, his eyes filled with desperation. He knew he was caught. He had no choice but to surrender. But he couldn't bring himself to give up just yet. He had come so close to pulling off the perfect heist. He wasn't ready to admit defeat. He knew he was trapped, cornered back where he started. Arthur hesitated for a moment, then sighed in defeat. He knew he was out of options. He reached for his prosthetic arm and, with a click, opened the hidden compartment. He carefully removed the emerald hummingbird brooch and held it out to Sarah. The other customers gasped as they realized what was happening. Mrs. Thompson rushed over, her face a mixture of anger and relief. Kevin, the security guard, stood by, ready to intervene if necessary. Here, Arthur said, his voice barely audible. Take it. You win. Sarah reached out and took the brooch, her fingers trembling slightly. She examined it closely, confirming that it was indeed the stolen item. She looked at Arthur, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and disappointment. Why, Arthur? She asked softly. Why did you do it? Arthur shrugged. I needed the money, he said, his voice deflated. I have a sick daughter. I needed to pay for her medical bills. It was another lie, of course, but Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. She knew he was a thief, but she also sensed that he was desperate. Mr. Davies stepped forward, his expression stern. That doesn't excuse what you did. You're still a criminal. Mrs. Thompson nodded in agreement. Call the police, Mr. Davies, she said, her voice cold. It's time to take this man away. As Mr. Davies reached for his phone, Arthur looked at Sarah, his eyes pleading. Please, he begged. Don't call the police. I'll do anything. Just give me a chance. Sarah hesitated. She knew she should do the right thing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Arthur's story than met the eye. She felt torn between her duty to gems and jewels, and her compassion for a desperate man. What was she going to do? The decision was in her hands. Sarah looked at Arthur, searching for any sign of truth in his eyes. She wanted to believe him, to believe that he was just a desperate father trying to save his daughter's life. But she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still lying. What's her name? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Your daughter. What's her name? Arthur hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around the room. Lily, he said finally. Her name is Lily. And what's wrong with her? Sarah pressed. Arthur looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumped. She has leukemia, he said, his voice choked with emotion. She needs a bone marrow transplant. It's very expensive. Sarah's heart ached for him. She wanted to believe him so badly. But something still didn't feel right. She glanced at Mr. Davies, who was watching Arthur with a skeptical expression. Call the police, Mr. Davies, Mrs. Thompson repeated, her voice cold and unwavering. Enough is enough. Mr. Davies nodded and raised his phone to his ear. Sarah knew she had to make a decision, and she had to make it fast. She looked at Arthur, his face etched with desperation. She thought about his lies, his deception, his theft. But she also thought about his supposed daughter, Lily, and the possibility that he was telling the truth. Wait! Sarah exclaimed, stopping Mr. Davies from dialing. Don't call them yet. I want to hear his story. I want to know if he's telling the truth. Mrs. Thompson glared at Sarah, her face contorted with anger. Are you out of your mind? He's a thief. He's lied to us from the beginning. I know, Sarah said, her voice trembling. But I need to know. I need to be sure. She turned back to Arthur, her eyes searching his. Tell me, Arthur. Tell me the truth. Is your daughter really sick? Is her name really Lily? Arthur looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. He knew this was his last chance. He had to convince her that he was telling the truth, or he was going to jail. The stakes had never been higher. Before Arthur could answer, the sound of sirens filled the air. 2 police officers entered, gems and jewels, their faces grim and authoritative. Mr. Davies had made the call. The decision had been made for Sarah. What's going on here? One of the officers asked, his eyes scanning the scene. Mr. Davies stepped forward. This man stole an emerald brooch from our store, he said, pointing at Arthur. We caught him trying to escape. The officers approached Arthur, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. Is this true? One of them asked. Arthur looked at Sarah, his eyes pleading. But she couldn't meet his gaze. She felt a mix of relief and sadness, a sense of both justice and disappointment. She had wanted to believe him, but she knew in her heart that he was a liar. It's true, Sarah said softly, her voice barely audible. He stole the brooch. The officers placed Arthur under arrest, handcuffing him and leading him out of the store. As he was being escorted away, he turned back to Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and regret. You'll regret this, he said, his voice low and menacing. You'll see. Sarah watched as the police officers led Arthur away, her heart heavy with sadness. She had been so eager to help him, to believe in his goodness. But in the end, she had been a fool. Her kindness had been exploited, her trust betrayed. Later that evening, after the police had left and the store had closed, Sarah stood in front of the engagement ring display case, staring at the glittering diamonds. She wondered about honesty and appearances, about the fine line between truth and deception. She thought about Arthur, about his lies and his charm, and about the emerald hummingbird brooch that had started it all. She realized that sometimes, things